General Hospital spoilers teased that Maxie Jones had always considered herself sharp enough to read the warning signs before trouble arrived. She had weathered more than her share of betrayal, manipulation, and loss, and she thought she could spot danger early. But danger doesn't always arrive like a storm with thunder in the distance. It can come quietly, slipping in unnoticed until it's already too close. And this time, it had a name: Jen Sidwell. The afternoon sun spilled through the deception office windows, casting long stripes of gold across the polished floors. Maxie sat at the conference table, sifting through paperwork and messages, her mind focused on the latest developments in the company's internal battle. The vote had been cast, and she was the only one who had chosen to hand over the evidence against Sonny Corinthos to the police. The air had been thick with tension when the results were read. Most of the others, Lucy Coe, Tracy Quartermaine, Brooklyn Quartermaine, had expected her to follow their lead and keep quiet. But Maxie's instincts told her that silence wasn't just a risk, it was complicity. She didn't regret her vote, but she knew it had put her on an island. And on that island, she could feel the eyes watching. Lucy had been the one to unintentionally make the situation worse. In her usual chatty, open way, she'd given an update about the vote, mentioning Maxie's position and even revealing her current location without realizing what she'd done. To most, it might have seemed like harmless gossip. To Jen Sidwell, it was an opportunity. Sidwell had made his feelings about Sonny's involvement with deception crystal clear. He didn't want trouble spilling into the company's image, and certainly not trouble that could bring the PCPD into play. The fact that Maxie's stepfather was the police commissioner only made her stand out more. To Sidwell, she was a risk. A risk that needed to be controlled, silenced, or removed before she could act further. Maxie, for her part, was unaware that she had just been marked as a problem to solve. She was already juggling the pressure from her colleagues, the weight of her own decision, and the faint unease that came from being on the wrong side of the vote. Across town, Sidwell leaned back in his chair after ending a call that confirmed what Lucy had let slip. Maxie's location, her schedule, her vulnerabilities, it was all in front of him now. His expression was difficult to read, but there was no mistaking the resolve in his eyes. He was not a man who believed in waiting for problems to resolve themselves. If Maxie had the potential to upend the delicate balance within deception and drag Sonny's name into legal jeopardy, then she needed to be dealt with swiftly and decisively. Lucy, still oblivious to the storm she'd set in motion, had gone back to strategizing with Tracy and Brooklyn. They all hoped Maxie would come around to their way of thinking, stick to the plan, and keep quiet. But hope was fragile, and none of them could guarantee her compliance. Tracy, ever pragmatic, had already warned that if Maxie refused to align with them, the fallout could be brutal. Brooklyn had echoed the concern, but with more frustration. She didn't like that they were even having to second-guess Maxie's loyalty. Sidwell wasn't interested in their internal debates. His was a more direct approach. The problem wasn't what Maxie might do in a meeting, it was what she might do outside of it, in conversations they couldn't control, in moments they wouldn't see coming. He began to piece together a plan, something that could be executed cleanly without leaving obvious fingerprints. Meanwhile, Maxie was preparing for what she thought would be a routine few days, possibly traveling for a deception-related meeting. The idea of getting out of Port Charles for a short time seemed almost like a relief, a break from the tense stares and whispered conversations in the office. She didn't notice the subtle changes in her environment, the unfamiliar car parked near her building 2 days in a row, the man at the coffee shop who didn't seem to be reading the book in front of him. Kristen Storm's real-life plans to take a brief hiatus to Tennessee were mirrored in Maxie's sudden decision to leave town for business. It seemed like nothing more than scheduling convenience, but behind the scenes, the path she was walking was being carefully shaped by Sidwell. Every step she took was leading her closer to the trap. The abduction wouldn't come with screaming or violence in the open. Sidwell understood that a clean operation was one where the victim barely realized the danger until it was too late. Perhaps it would begin with an invitation. A car waiting to take her to a meeting that didn't exist, a call from someone she trusted urging her to meet in a secluded location. Maxie would follow, unsuspecting, until the moment the door shut behind her and the locks clicked. At first, her disappearance might not raise alarms. Deception's inner circle could assume she was away on business. Friends might think she needed space. Days could pass before the realization sank in that she wasn't answering calls, wasn't sending her usual quick updates. By then, Sidwell would have achieved his primary goal, keeping her isolated, cutting her off from the people who could help her, and ensuring she couldn't act against Sonny or against him. Inside whatever place Sidwell chose for her confinement, perhaps a warehouse with windows boarded from the inside, or a rented cabin miles from the nearest neighbor, Maxie would be left to confront not only her physical predicament but the gnawing fear of not knowing who had orchestrated it. Her mind would race through possibilities, weighing whether it was tied to her vote, to Sonny, or to something older from her tangled past. In Port Charles, the people closest to her would begin to sense the truth. Lucy might be the first to piece it together, realizing too late that her casual slip of information had been the opening someone needed. Guilt would claw at her, but guilt wouldn't be enough to undo the damage. Tracy would push for immediate action, her tone sharp and decisive, while Brooklyn might wrestle with whether they should involve the police at all, given the political minefield surrounding Sonny's name. But for Sidwell, this was the point: create enough confusion and hesitation that by the time anyone moved decisively, he would have already tightened his control. His fear wasn't that Maxie would talk now, it was that she might, at any moment, decide to break ranks. And in his mind, the only safe way to deal with that was to remove her entirely from the board. Maxie, resourceful as ever, wouldn't stay passive for long. Even if she couldn't identify her captor, she'd start testing boundaries, searching for weaknesses, cataloging the details of her surroundings. Every creak in the floorboards, every faint hum of machinery outside the walls, would be noted. She would keep track of the schedule of whoever brought her food or checked on her. For Maxie, survival was as much about gathering information as it was about enduring the isolation. And somewhere out there, the clock would already be ticking, not just on her freedom, but on how long Sidwell could keep his secrets hidden before the whole tangled web of deception's internal politics unraveled in front of everyone. The first sign that something was wrong came not from a panicked phone call, but from silence. Maxie had always been quick to respond, even during business trips, her messages peppered with updates, complaints about hotel coffee, or quick notes about the kids. This time, there was nothing. Hours passed, then a full day, before Lucy noticed. She mentioned it in passing to Tracy and Brooklyn, expecting one of them to say they'd heard from her. When neither had, a new tension rippled through the room. Lucy's face paled as she mentally retraced her steps, recalling the conversation where she had casually shared Maxie's location with someone she thought she could trust. The realization that her words might have put Maxie in danger hit hard, and her stomach sank. Tracy, sharp-eyed and pragmatic, caught the shift in Lucy's expression immediately. When Lucy admitted what she'd said, Tracy's voice hardened, demanding details, every word, every name. Brooklyn sat back, processing. Her first instinct was to protect the company and avoid a public scandal, but Maxie's absence wasn't something that could be buried quietly. Still, involving the police wasn't straightforward. Maxie's stepfather, the police commissioner, would take the case personally, and that meant the investigation could easily bleed into areas tied to deception and Sonny Corinthos. Brooklyn knew the deeper the police dug, the higher the chance that something else, something none of them wanted exposed, could come to light. Sidwell, however, wasn't thinking about police strategies or PR optics. From the moment Maxie failed to appear at her next scheduled meeting, he knew the plan was working exactly as intended. The location he had chosen was far enough from Port Charles to delay any immediate search efforts but close enough for him to keep control. A converted storage facility on the edge of an industrial district served his purpose as well: soundproof, minimal foot traffic, and easily secured. Inside, Maxie had been left in a room that gave away almost nothing: bare walls, a single locked door, and no windows. The air was cool, and the low hum of distant machinery told her she was near some kind of operating plant. Her phone had been taken, but her mind was working non-stop. She replayed the last few days, searching for the moment when things had turned. The call about the meeting, the car that had pulled up on time, the driver who barely spoke, every detail seemed harmless in isolation, but together they formed a path that led here. She didn't know Sidwell was behind it, but she knew whoever had arranged this had planned it well. There were no signs of struggle, no witnesses, nothing that would leave an obvious trail. That meant whoever was responsible had experience keeping people quiet. Back in Port Charles, Lucy's guilt had shifted into panic. She pushed Tracy to act, insisting they at least contact Mac privately. Tracy resisted at first, warning that bringing him in would turn the situation into a police matter they couldn't control. But Lucy argued that time mattered more than secrecy. The longer they waited, the less chance Maxie had. Brooklyn listened quietly, weighing the options, but every instinct told her that no matter which path they chose, the fallout would be messy. Mac, once informed, didn't waste time. His calls went unanswered, and his inquiries quickly revealed that Maxie hadn't checked in anywhere she was supposed to be. His badge gave him access to channels Lucy and the others didn't have, and soon there were discreet checks at airports, train stations, and known business contacts. The lack of leads was both unusual and alarming. It suggested the disappearance had been orchestrated by someone who understood how investigations worked. Sidwell, anticipating this, kept his movements clean. Any contact with Maxie was handled indirectly, through people with no obvious link to him or the company. He wasn't interested in hurting her unless he had no choice, he simply needed her unavailable and unable to undermine him until the current crisis passed. Still, he knew situations like this could spiral, and he had to be ready to escalate if she became a bigger threat from within her confinement. Inside the locked room, Maxie tested the door and walls for weaknesses. The hinges were solid, and the lock was secure from the outside. She counted the footsteps of her captor, noting that they only came twice a day, once to drop off food, once to check in. The voice she heard was low, distorted, giving her no clue who it belonged to. Her best hope was to find something small, something overlooked, that could be used to her advantage. Lucy, unable to sit still, began her own search, calling anyone who might have seen Maxie before she vanished. Most said no, but one contact mentioned seeing her get into a car that didn't match her usual ride. It was a thin lead, but it was enough to stir Mac into action. Brooklyn started to see the bigger picture and realized this wasn't just about Maxie's vote or Sonny's connection to deception. If Sidwell or someone like him had gone this far, then Maxie's silence was about more than protecting Sonny, it was about controlling the narrative entirely. That meant anyone who knew too much could be next. Tracy began preparing for the possibility that they'd have to face Sidwell directly. She didn't like him, didn't trust him, and had always suspected his loyalty was to himself above all else. If he was involved, confronting him would be risky, but it might also be the only way to flush him out. The days ahead promised a collision course. Mac's investigation was tightening, Lucy's guilt was pushing her toward rash decisions, Brooklyn's caution was giving way to suspicion, and Tracy's resolve was hardening into something sharper. And in the center of it all, Maxie sat in her locked room, her mind fixed on escape, knowing that if she couldn't get out soon, the people she loved might never find her in time. Rain began to fall against the corrugated metal roof of the warehouse, a slow, steady patter that masked the faintest noises from inside. Maxie had been counting those sounds for days, using every minute to memorize the routine of her captor. She knew the timing of the meals, the pauses in the footsteps, the subtle click of keys before the door opened. She had no clear escape route yet, but her resolve had sharpened into something fierce. She wasn't going to wait for rescue, she would make her own way out if she had to. In Port Charles, Mac was piecing together the slivers of information he'd gathered. The mysterious car had been traced to a rental under a false name, but security footage caught only enough to confirm the driver was wearing a cap and sunglasses. No plates were visible. He could feel the clock ticking in the back of his mind, each hour without a lead tightening the noose. Mac wasn't just a police commissioner on a case, he was a stepfather looking for family, and that personal stake gave him little patience for bureaucracy. Lucy's nerves were fraying. She replayed every conversation she'd had about Maxie in the past 2 weeks, wondering if there had been more than one leak. She kept picturing Sidwell's expression the last time they'd spoken, polite, calm, but with a coldness behind the eyes that didn't match his words. She tried telling herself she didn't have proof, but her instincts screamed otherwise. Tracy had started her own parallel approach. While Mac was pulling official strings, she was leaning on old business contacts, some of whom moved in less than legal circles. Tracy didn't mind getting her hands dirty if it meant finding Maxie, and she suspected Sidwell was too careful to leave evidence in any public place. If he'd arranged this, he'd hidden his tracks in shadows she knew how to search. Brooklyn's role became unexpectedly active when she overheard Sidwell on a tense phone call in a quiet corner of the deception offices. The conversation was short, clipped, and ended the moment he saw her. There was no outright admission of anything, but the look in his eyes when he realized she'd heard his voice raised was enough to make her skin crawl. That was the moment she decided Sidwell wasn't just a name on their suspect list, he was the one holding the strings. Meanwhile, Maxie found her first real chance. During the evening meal drop, the captor's hand brushed too close to the inside edge of the doorframe, revealing a gap in the otherwise smooth metal where two panels met. It wasn't enough to squeeze through, but it told her the walls weren't seamless. She started to work on it with the only tool she had, an old spoon from the meal tray, flattened against the concrete until the handle could wedge into the narrow seam. Sidwell's confidence began to slip when one of his intermediaries failed to check in on time. He had built the operation on precision and control, but now there were variables creeping in. The storm outside had knocked out power in parts of the industrial district, forcing him to visit the site personally to ensure everything was secure. It was the one move he'd sworn not to make, but circumstances left him no choice. Max's investigation finally broke through when one of his officers found a pattern in traffic camera data. A vehicle matching the general description from the rental had been spotted repeatedly near a cluster of abandoned warehouses just before the storm. It was enough to narrow the search radius. Mac called in a small, trusted team, not wanting to risk the news leaking to the wrong ears. Inside, Maxie heard something different that night, the faint sound of an engine idling much closer than usual. She could sense movement outside her door, the rhythm of footsteps she hadn't heard before. Whoever it was, they were heavier, slower, and not as careful about their noise. She pressed herself against the wall, spoon still in hand, listening for a clue. Sidwell stepped into the dim light of the storage room, his expression almost casual, as though this were a meeting in an office instead of an abduction. "You've put yourself in a difficult position, Maxie," he said evenly. "I could have left you alone, but you made choices that forced my hand." He didn't raise his voice, but the weight of his presence made the air feel thinner. Maxie met his gaze, refusing to flinch. "You think locking me in here will keep me quiet forever?" she asked, her tone steady despite the pounding of her heart. Sidwell gave no answer, only a small, knowing smile before closing the door again. Outside, the storm masked the approach of Mac's team. Moving under cover of darkness, they spread out, each checking entrances while Mac circled to the back. The wind rattled the metal siding, covering the sound of a lock being picked. Brooklyn, unable to stay behind, had followed at a distance and now waited in the shadows, ready to point Mac toward the right building if she saw movement. Inside the room, Maxie had worked the spoon deeper into the scene when she heard the faintest metallic scrape from the other side of the wall. It didn't match the sound of the lock she'd heard before, it was more deliberate, methodical. She froze, wondering if it was Sidwell returning or something else entirely. The door swung open not with the harsh clang she expected, but a controlled motion that revealed Mac's silhouette. Relief hit her in a rush, but there was no time for reunion. He motioned for silence and pulled her out quickly, keeping low as they moved through the darkened hall. Sidwell, realizing too late that the site had been compromised, doubled back toward the warehouse just as the team was slipping away. He caught sight of them for a split second before Mac's backup intercepted him. There was a brief scuffle, and Sidwell was taken down, his plans collapsing in the space of minutes. By the time they emerged into the rain-soaked street, Brooklyn was already on the phone to Lucy, her voice shaking with a mix of adrenaline and relief. Maxie, wrapped in Mac's jacket, didn't look back at the warehouse. She knew Sidwell's arrest wouldn't erase what had happened, but it would give her the space to breathe again. Back at Deception, the aftermath would be messy. The company's leadership would fracture further under the weight of accusations, with Lucy struggling to reconcile her part in the chain of events and Tracy insisting they move forward as if nothing had happened. Brooklyn, however, would make it clear that they could no longer pretend Sidwell's influence hadn't poisoned everything. Maxie, though, had already made her decision. Once she recovered, she would confront the board herself, not to plead for trust, but to warn them. What happened to her wasn't just a power play, it was a message. And if they ignored it, she wouldn't be the last to disappear.